if you don't know about AmeriCorps, it is a national service organization. It's kind of the domestic version of the Peace Corps. So people that volunteer their time, quite a bit of their time, 40 hours a week for like 6 months. Yeah, I think that comes out for 5 months. For 5 months, and the science school has hosted an AmeriCorps program for this semester, and through that we get to be a host site. So we are hosting Rachel. She's with us for these 5 months, and the one of her main goals is looking at science literacy. So we thought, okay, this makes perfect sense. As the National Museum of Wildlife Art, we're certainly connected to science and would love for science literacy to be something that comes out through our programs and our exhibits. So Rachel has agreed to lead the training with her background and expertise about science and trying to bring some of that awareness to all of us and thinking about ways that we can use it in tours or when we interact with visitors. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and Rachel's going to tell us about some wildlife things.
Hi guys. So part of my job here is to increase science capacity in the community. So I thought I would take this opportunity to let you guys know about what is going on with wildlife in Jackson, or the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, for spring. I have about 15 of these packets here. I'm not sure how many we have left, but if you guys wanted to share, perhaps you can pass those around, and maybe two people to pack it. It's just some basic information about 3 particular themes that I'm going to be touching on today. The 3 themes today are seasonal migration corridors, hibernation, and trophic cascades. I don't know if any of you...
Oh, I talk about trophic cascades all the time.
Do you really? Yeah. That makes me so happy. Thank you. So important. It really is, especially here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I was going to give you guys a little tour. So we were going to go through the galleries, and I was going to stop off at a few places and just kind of give you a little bit of information about these 3 particular themes that I'm going to be touching on for today. So I think that a good place to start would be in the conservation gallery at the Pronghorn side. So if everyone wants to join me. So the point of this is just kind of when you're leading these tours, or when you're being gallery guides, or if you're a docent, to be able to take the information you already have about wildlife and your experiences with these pieces of art. So everyone, I assume, has their own way of going about giving these tours, their own kind of particular way they like to do things. But I really want to emphasize that a good way to relay information about what you're seeing in the paintings back to people is through stories and your own experiences. So I wanted to start with the Pronghorn section of the Conservation Gallery, because obviously the whole point of the Conservation Gallery is to shed light on endangered species that are in desperate need of preservation. And the pronghorn is one of these particular species native to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem that is in great need of conservation. So I just wanted to start off with some images. Have you guys, I'm guessing that many of you have seen the pronghorn pathways that are, the arches that are over the highway system? Do you know why those are there? Exactly. migration and their wildlife crossings. The state has implemented these wildlife corridor crossings in order to make these migratory paths more accessible for the pronghorn and to lessen the impact that vehicles and collisions and people are having on their migratory corridors. So that's just a little background information on why those highway arches exist. And another point that I wanted to make was that, and actually I have an image of King Carlson's pronghorn right here. Another point that I wanted to make is that pronghorn have a very specific way in which they migrate. They have very short, thin legs. So during, the winter season, when the winter season is coming to a close and spring is arriving, there's still a lot of snowpack on the ground, so it's not easy to navigate through huge depths of snow. So they mainly stick to water tributaries and cliff sides in order to graze. So that's why a lot of times you won't see them unless they're crossing the road in their designated path, because they usually stick to water sources. But the whole point of what I want you to take away from this is that whenever you're giving these tours, to kind of ask people questions. I feel like that's a good way to start things out, is like, well, what do you see? And for example, in King Carlson's spring antelope, I would say, well, obviously this is not winter time. The setting, there's no snowpack on the ground. There seems to be flowers blooming and sagebrush, and I would start off with, well, obviously you can interpret from this painting that this is a time of year where there's a lot of grazing going on. And I would basically try to pull that out of people. That's my suggestion to you, is just, you don't have to know exactly what's happening in the painting, but to be able to relay the information that you see back to them. And I wanted to show you this map of pronghorn migration corridors. Hopefully you'll be able to see. But up here we have Grand Teton National Park, and the majority of their migration starts right below that in the Red Hills, east of Jackson, and they like to travel down south towards Pinedale. And then usually will settle in and around Trappers Point. Does anyone know where that is? Yeah. So that's the majority of their pathways that they take whenever they're migrating. And another good example that we have here in the Museum of Migration is Tom Utek's Indashian. And I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with this painting that's in the Odd Couple exhibit. This is a fabulous example. If you wanted to keep the theme of migration in mind, if you're giving a tour, this is a really good example, because it has a massive flock of birds that are moving across the landscape. And you could use that as a great segue of, well, every fall, right before winter begins, birds will migrate south where it's warmer. And I wanted to segue into the concept of Trophic Cascades. In this particular photo, which it would probably be more helpful if we were actually standing in front of it. So, do you guys mind if we go into the Odd Couple exhibit, and I can speak a little bit when we get over there? I do know what one good point to make about this particular piece, and I believe it's probably said so on the plaque, But what good point is that he doesn't take photographs and he doesn't kind of reproduce any particular images that he has when he's in these places. He completely does everything from memory. So this is kind of in his moment what he was seeing in his mind. So maybe it was a day where he just got caught up in a massive migration, and most likely looks like it's summertime due to the colors used. And of course in summertime we have a crazy influx of mosquitoes and other insects that are around.
So are you sure this is really migration or just birds flying by?
Well, that's the thing. The whole point is, the thing about these paintings is none of them have to be taken literally. Everything has a story. It's left up to your perspective and your imagination. I like to think of it as migration because we have lots of movement happening. And we can infer from the photo that there's several different species of birds that are being represented. And it is the fact that they're all facing in one direction that you could interpret from that, potentially they're going south. That it's maybe summer moving into fall, and that soon it's starting to get cold.
One hour isn't going.
Summer, they're facing different directions. Yeah.
So,
Most of you guys know, there's one hour that's on there.
yeah, so when you guys look at this particular painting, what are the first thoughts that come to your mind?
There's a lot of birds. Yeah, I know, me too. I really like it.
Wish the artist would come and talk about it.
A lot of movements. There's a flying fox in there somewhere.
Yeah, so that's a good point, is that when we look at something like this, the first thing we usually notice is all of the different birds that are being represented. But the thing that I find interesting is that we have the wolves that are also being represented. And this is a good way for me to start to explain the concept of trophic cascades. Trophic cascades are a kind of ordering system, in a way like a food web. I don't know if you guys are familiar with food webs. But the point of it is we have an apex predator, like a wolf, who is at the top of the food chain. He is pretty much the main predator, aside from a bear that you're going to encounter. And then below the wolf, we have our ungulates, like our elk and our moose, who typically are the prey for wolves. Moose, most of the time, they're juveniles, they're babies. And then below that, we have what those species feast on, which is the sagebrush and the grasses. And so the point of trophic cascades is the idea of if you remove an apex predator, like a wolf, what happens to the rest of the system? And a lot of the times, and we experienced this whenever we had the almost extinction of wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and we experienced an influx of an overpopulation of elk, if you want to call it that. So it's the idea when you have removing an apex predator and the fluctuations that occur with overpopulation of their prey. And in turn, if you remove, if you have an overpopulation of elk, you're going to have overgrazing. So you're going to have loss of sagebrush and those grasses and all those key elements.
Preparing there is
Right. So I like to use this painting as kind of one of the templates for that, because you have interaction going on between different species. And so, to give you a better example, we're going to move into the JKM gallery, if you want to come with me. As far as trophic cascades go, if you wanted to utilize this theme in your tour, I really think that this one is probably the greatest place to start. Because you have this, upon first look, you have this really interesting dynamic going on between these two major apex predators, the grizzly bear and the wolf. And I like to ask people kind of, what they think is going on. And a lot of times people will start off by saying, well, I like to ask them, who do you think got there first?
Sure.
Which is the key question that's happening in the story, right? Who got there first? Did the grizzly bear, you know, find the deer and take down the deer, or did the wolf do it? Because you have, interestingly enough, you have this wolf over here who looks as if he is walking away. Maybe he was there, he got snuffed out by the grizzly bear, and he's backing down. He realizes there's no contest. But you have this guy over here who, as you hopefully should know, wolves like to hunt in packs. So there's an interesting dynamic of, you know, is this wolf off to the left attempting to jump on this guy, the grizzly bear's back, and take what's his? Are they going to gang up on the grizzly bear and take back their food source? Or are they going to realize where their place is and back down? So that's kind of the way I like to introduce what an apex predator is. You have the guys at the top of the food chains, the main predators, the ones who pretty much nobody else messes with. And the interesting competition that happens between them in terms of food source. Do any of you have any other things you want to add about maybe your own interpretation of this game? Or anything else you
I think it's, although people ask, it's pretty obvious that it was a wolf kill because of how it was killed, nose, throat. You know, if you've ever seen a wolf kill, they hamstring, they jump the nose with the throat.
They usually, all the pack attacks from the back takes down the
They
legs.
also try to jump the front. Man, I've seen wolf kills in Yellowstone where they're just all over. But I've also seen a bear kill a small elk, and it just goes,
Yeah.
you know, I gotcha.
Yeah.
When you have claws that are several inches long, and one swipe that could take down a 250-pound man, you know, there's not much effort involved with something like that.
I did ask a naturalist in Yellowstone once about wolves stealing the bears, and they said it does occasionally happen. The bear is not as attentive as he could be. They'll run in and grab a haunch, and the bear is smart enough not to leave the kill because he knows the minute he does, all the other wolves will be in there taking the piece.
Yeah.
So, but it normally goes the other way.
Wolves are almost these little tag-along characters a lot of the times. They will, you'll find them hanging around with grizzly bears because in a way they're like scavengers. You know, maybe sometimes the bears will pretty much take as much as they possibly want and they'll leave bits and pieces. And then you'll see wolves kind of get in there and take the leftovers. But they do hang around. They're kind of like vultures. They like to hang around and potentially steal away dinner. So that's an interesting thought. But yeah, I think that those are good points that when you bring people to this particular painting, that's a good point to bring out this kind of the social dynamics that happens between these two major key players.
Does anybody remember hearing the biologist here, the story that I've taken from that visit and tell about this painting was they've seen both scenarios up in Yellowstone, but it's not uncommon to see a pack of wolves out on a hunt and a grizzly bear sauntering along, pretending to pay no attention. And if the wolves make a kill, he rushes in and says, out of here, I get first pick. Does anybody else remember hearing that story? Yes. And he said, judging from, like Susan said, the wounds on the elk calf, he would say this was a wolf kill. And then I always like to say to people, yeah, Charlie Russell knew wolves as well as he painted grizzlies. Knew them as well as he knew grizzlies. But he painted them in a different way. Why? And get them to talk about.
That's really good point.
And then they start looking at and they come up with all these fun things.
It's a great example of a grizzly, isn't it? I mean, he's got everything in it, you know.
And what was fun was when we had the Audubon, John Woodhouse Audubon grizzly over there for a little while, and you could compare them. You knew who knew grizzlies and who did not.
That's really great. I think that's really important is, to take those personal experiences you've had talking with other people. Maybe you've spoken to a wildlife biologist. Maybe there is something interesting that you could add to the conversation that'll get your audience talking about it. Because a lot of the times if you just ask, what's going on in this photo, it can only really get you so far. So I feel like conversation is really important because getting that kind of feedback to happen, people realize they may know more than they actually do. So, that is my little spiel on Trophic Cascades.
There was an article in some wildlife magazine a week or two ago that said something new about it, that with the wolf reintroduction and the restoring of the Trophic Cascade in Yellowstone, that it has helped the rivers.
Yes.
Oh,
Did you
yes,
get
I
that?
saw that too.
There's an entire...
More about that.
Yeah, I just read this article about how it, did you see that?
I saw it on
Because
Nova or
we're
something.
not breaking down the banks as much, and so
Right
the
there.
rivers, yeah.
There's a really intricate
Passed around the internet.
process that occurs between when you have your top predators and then you have their prey, and then you have all of the vegetation that they're feasting on, and all of the chemical processes that happen to that vegetation. And in turn, it affects water levels, it affects, oxygen content in water in different tributaries. There's a very intricate, interesting system that happens when you reintroduce this top predator back into the system, and everything kind of not really gets thrown out of balance, but in a way kind of restores itself. So that's interesting.
One of the articles I read said they went from 2 to 12 beaver dams in North Yellowstone because the willows were coming back. So the beavers came back, and then other things came back. And,
The songbirds.
yeah, the songbirds.
The song,
And,
the book Decade of the Wolf, it's been more than 10 years since they were introduced, but Doug Smith's book, Decade of the Wolf, it talks about a lot of things that have changed during his first 10 years after the wolves were
Yeah, you have, aspen and all this conifer that's being, blooming and regenerating itself pretty much. It's this intricate system of what's happening with the wildlife in terms of also what's happening with the environment it's really interesting. So.
And, I think we're all aware that the wolf issue, it can be a hot topic, but when Tom Segerstrom came to do his presentation, one of the things I really took away from him is his approach of, we're kind of observing. Like, we certainly can say what has happened in the past 10 years since they were reintroduced, but that it really is a process of seeing what does happen, and that it doesn't always have to be such a polarizing issue, that it can be, we don't necessarily have a right and a wrong, or, we're observing how this impacts all these different levels. And I liked how he was able to take that approach where we might all have our personal opinions about
I
it.
find that if you just add one line at the end, and you say, this and that, and all the animals, this, you say that, how wonderful it's been, you said, except of course for ranchers. They do have legitimate concerns. And then just drop it at that, and if you acknowledge it, then anybody that's, about hunting, it's okay.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's really the outfitters that,
Yeah, it's
almost the outfitters more than.
Yeah, I think in terms of an issue like this, it's good to be informative, but, you let people kind of make their own opinions about it, and I think giving that little bit of leverage of, and here's the other side of this issue, then they'll feel inclined to maybe do their own research and find out for themselves.
Just acknowledge that it exists.
Right. Awesome. Well, I'm so surprised you guys know so much. So,
But when you live here, you become curious.
exactly, and you guys have all lived here longer than me, so I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff that you know that I don't know.
I'm glad that you're talking about this, because I find that people are fascinated by it, and I think it's good for us to include.
I think that video that was going around the internet was called Why Wolves Change Rivers. Remember that?
Yes, that's good.
Yeah.
That's what it was, I think, Gigi.
So I just had one more theme that I wanted to touch on. Hopefully we're still good on time. And that is hibernation and what occurs after hibernation. So I have one particular bear example that I wanted to direct you guys to. So we're going to come to the hallway.
Make everybody stop here.
I do too.
Do you really?
Yes, because first of all, we want more women artists here. And this one was very popular and died at the age of 50, so we'll never see anything new. But she did atmosphere so well.
Yeah.
Along with showing how
And this
much
is Glacier
space
Park too.
the grizzly
so-
has. Doesn't it though?
It's Glacier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that where it is? It's like sure.
So the reason I brought you guys to this one in terms of trying to just touch on the subject of hibernation is because I feel like this is a great example of a mother grizzly with her 2 cubs. And the information I gather when I look at this painting is that she's on a bit of a hunting lesson with them. She's essentially taking her cubs out who, from what I'm gathering in my own story that I've made up in my head, is that it's now springtime and the cubs have emerged from the den and the mama grizzly wants to show them how to hunt. And so it looks like when you're looking at this painting as if she is looking around, kind of looking for food sources or water sources, places that she could feed on. Because as you guys know, that hibernation is a very taxing process that occurs on a grizzly bear's body. They essentially feast prior to winter. They'll gain up to, I think, about 30 pounds a day, something ridiculous like that, in order to build up their fat storage. And then, of course, whenever they're hibernating, their metabolism slows down, and their body is essentially feeding off of those fat reserves. Their heartbeat slows down. It's almost their bodies become this like dormant, slowed state. And so obviously when spring arrives and they reemerge from their dens, there's this frenzy of like feasting that occurs. And so you'll find these guys out eating constantly, just constantly. So, and in turn, with hibernation and springtime and kind of this reemergence back into the environment, there's a lot of reproduction that happens. And so I wanted to exemplify kind of this like mother cubs and how you could go about getting people to think about, when springtime occurs, what they're actually after, which is feasting. Does anybody else have anything in their own experience that they like to add to this particular painting, maybe about the artist?
She was wonderful. She was amazing. We had that other one, JKM, too.
Yeah, the
And that
foxes.
with the foxes. And she just shows atmosphere so well.
Atmosphere.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she
so I
really
feel like
does.
you could throw that in there if you potentially want to hit on the subject of springtime.
And then really, grizzlies need a lot of space.
Yes, that's
I always touch on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can infer from this picture that it almost looks like they're the only ones out there. The land is so expansive.
She wanted to show you that.
Right. I feel like she wanted to be able to showcase kind of the...
Have you looked at the grizzly in the studio on the wall that he painted, the climate studio? It's autumn and there's this skinny grizzly And it's great to
I
ask
think, is it on
people,
the other side? I feel like I know which one you're
yeah,
talking
it's
about.
great to ask people, you think this wolf's gonna make it through the, or this bear's gonna make it through the winter?
Right. Those are kind of the things I want you guys to
Yeah.
look for in the paintings if you potentially want to talk about hibernation is
Yeah.
to really like look at the subject like, well, that looks like a skinny bear. So maybe we can infer from how skinny the bear is that they have just emerged from their dens. That are
Except
coming
it's
out of
autumn.
hibernation.
It does look like
It's
autumn.
the autumn.
See, how do you know this is
this is
spring?
autumn.
'Cause I would say this is
I
autumn.
always thought this was autumn.
Yeah.
Because the cubs are,
They're not tiny anymore.
they've been through the summer, they're a
I
little
think so
bigger.
too.
Yeah.
I think they're fastening up for the winter.
Do we
Yeah,
know?
that's kind of what I had thought. I don't know.
I think a great way to be able to just ask the people that you're giving the tour to, maybe they have some insight, maybe they have their perspective leads them to believe that this is spring and not autumn. Maybe there's some type of, because as though you can tell there's no snow on the ground, there's still a lot of misting going on out here up top. So you could probably infer from that, you know, even though it's not in the middle of winter, it's that transition.
And this is maybe a good example of, like, if you're wanting, if you're wanting to lead a tour in a certain direction, maybe you start by saying, this could be spring, this could be autumn. Today, let's pretend that it's spring. Like,
You don't have to make it, you don't have to make
for
it
our
literal.
purposes, let's go with spring. Now we're going to talk about
I feel like, if you wanted to go the story route, that's a good way to start. It was like, what do you guys think is happening?
Just out or of hibernation or just going into hibernation. In either case, it's feasting. Yeah.
Had another doesn't change.
Yeah, their behavior. Yeah, their behavior. Yeah.
And I also like to showcase this one that's in Rungus as a food source. Here's what bears eat. Obviously they eat a lot of berries. That's their primary diet, is a lot of berries. They'll feast on berries for days. But fish makes up a large majority of their protein. So this is a good example of, if you wanted to showcase what do the bears eat. And Rungus, he's really good at that, actually, because he loves to focus on those really charismatic big characters like the grizzly bear and black bear. So if you wanted to kind of go into these particular themes, I like his work, and I like what's mainly in the JKM because it's so varied, and there's so many different. Because we have animals in their environment in one section, and then we have predator and prey in another section. And so if you wanted to switch it up a little bit and keep things really diverse, I like the JKM for those subjects. So, I don't want to bore you guys to death, but so those were just my three kind of key themes that I wanted to throw out at you today, and I hope that you potentially can incorporate them into your tour at some point. And if you feel so inclined to do more research, which I always encourage, I think that's a great thing if you wanted to maybe get a little more in depth into Trophic Cascades, and there's a few things that you feel like would be really interesting to bring into a tour. I think that's a really great idea. So,
Thank you.
yeah, take these home, read them. I mean, they're not terribly boring. I didn't bog down with a bunch of jargon.
And we will make more copies of those and put them in the office for anyone that didn't get them. And thank you all so much for coming today.